Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to do a bit of a ramble video about cutting targets, various mediums, what's available, thoughts on them, what lessons can be learned from them, that type of ramble video about the various types of targets I've personally cut with, that I cut often in my videos, that I have access to, or that I use in my various attempts at being better at swordsmanship. So anyway, if you're interested in that kind of thing, stick around. It's going to be a bit of a talky head video, and I can't blame you for tuning out if you're not interested. If you are, then bear in mind a couple things. One, this is not an exhaustive list of all the cutting mediums that are out there. It's in no way extensive, and if you have thoughts or observations about other cutting mediums that might be helpful, throw it in the commentary down below. I'm limited by my own knowledge and experience, but also by the kind of availability of cost-effective cutting targets in my area. So like, for example, green bamboo would be great if it would grow in my area, but it does not, because it's winter nigh perpetually where I live, except for now where it's like 1,000,000 degrees outside. But I guess that's because I'm made for 20 below and not 100 above. So anyway, point is, not an exhaustive list. If you have thoughts or observations, throw it in the commentary down below. I hope there's some fun conversation that starts from the ramblings that I'm about to do. The other thing I kind of want to make mention of is that I'm not an authority matter on this subject. I am an enthusiast. I'm trying to get better myself, but I'm not a teacher. I'm not qualified to give you any kind of advice on swordsmanship. And more importantly, I don't think that cutting stationary targets is the end-all be-all of swordsmanship. It's fun as an entertainment thing, and I'm not trying to degrade what you do if being really good at cutting stationary targets is your objective and doing it precisely, and it's a lot of fun. But at the same time, if you think of kind of a martial fencing or swordsmanship in the sense of somebody else trying to cut you who's moving around and you wanting to do the same to them, ideally without getting cut back yourself, swordsman, this type of cutting target is not going to, I don't think it's necessarily the best time investment to get better at that specifically. So I do think cutting things is certainly helpful to swordsmanship. I think it's a worthy thing to do. I think there's information that can be garnered from it, but I don't want to insinuate as I talk throughout this video that it is the only thing that you can do, or that in any way it just enables you to be a great swordsman and defend yourself in a fencing type capacity. So again, if you're just trying to cut stationary targets and that's your bag, I agree, it's fun as hell. Keep at it, do your thing. But I do want to separate that as I talk about the lessons learned or why I find them maybe helpful in swordsmanship, that I'm not trying to suggest that cutting only stationary targets makes you ninja master swordsman. So anyway, with that context in mind, I'm going to ramble about the various cutting mediums that I've come across and maybe some thoughts and observations about them. So the mediums that I'm going to mention are water bottles, pool noodles, tatami mats, paper of various types, whether it be Corrugate or loose newspaper, and some kind of fun party tricks that you might be able to do to make targets out of them. Saplings, bamboo, which is, saplings are my, young trees that are about an inch around, are kind of the closest analogy that I have to a green bamboo, and then some of the abusive stuff that I'll talk about later. Now, the basic stuff that I'm cutting, or that I'm going to mention in this video, are all going to tell some kind of story. So rather than harp on it consistently every time, you got to measure when you're taking a target and cutting it, what are you trying to accomplish by cutting it? If it's just shits and giggles and swinging around and having fun and you're not really trying to accomplish anything in particular, then okie doke. If you are, then what information can you garner from that cut? And there's a couple things that you might be able to, that might aid you in doing that. One is certainly make a plan. What are you actually trying to do? What cut are you trying to execute, and how well are you trying to execute it? How should you, in what position should you be in when you start and end? For example, are you kind of swinging from the fences? Are you starting from a low position? Do you want your sword to end in a kind of offensive or kind of guarded position? And are you doing that? I've found that obviously recording myself for the purposes of YouTube allows me to reflect on that footage. I'm not necessarily impressed with the results, but it is certainly helpful as a training tool. And if you have access to a camera where you can record yourself practicing reviewing that footage, even if it isn't to share with others, it can certainly be a helpful thing in correcting your posture, your feedback. What you want to do is back the camera up far enough where you can see where you start and where you stop, though. So it's not necessarily about cutting the target if that's the objective, or focusing the camera on the target. It's about focusing it on you so that you can adjust your movements and such and get a clear view of what you're doing. So camera is one thing that certainly helped, and reviewing the target after you've cut it is certainly another. So making it through a target isn't necessarily always the objective. Generally speaking, you want to cut the target in two, but each target, each cut is going to tell a little bit of a story. Now, you can see very clean, like 45-degree angle cuts. If you have some sort of protractor or something to measure the angles that you're doing, generally a completely flat angle or a 45-degree angle is at least what we're shooting for, or I'm shooting for when I'm doing the majority of my cuts. But if that's not your aim, then what are you trying to do? Sometimes for me, it helps not to cheat by writing down on the target what I'm trying to do. I'll take a Sharpie and I'll draw on the tatami mat or on the paper where I'm trying to cut so I can see how close I am. And I know that there's no way for me to cheat, right? I've marked on the target, what am I trying to do? What line am I trying to follow? And I can kind of gauge how close to that I am or am not. And usually it's not at all, but it is at least helpful for me not to cheat myself in the exercise. So those are things that can help. Generally, you want your cuts to be clean. I'm not qualified to really tell you how to identify whether you're scalloping a cut or cutting too sharp or your edge alignment is necessarily off simply by reading it, but there are certainly capable YouTubers that can tell you that kind of information. And each of those cuts is going to tell a story and hopefully tell you where do you need to work on it. Are you coming in too steep? Do you not have enough chutzpah in the cut? Reviewing the footage might give you some idea of where you're cutting on the sword. There's some unexpected things that you can learn by reviewing the results of your cuts and ideally looking at yourself while you do said cuts. So anyway, those are some kind of feedback on how to review, because each one of these mediums that I'm going to talk about, each one of these types of targets is going to have some sort of story to tell you afterwards, and all of them can be useful in improving, which is, I think, the main goal. So there we go. I won't harp on it all the time, but I'm going to just kind of mention that all of them will have said feedback, except for probably the abusive ones. I don't know that those will necessarily be as useful, but I'll talk about that towards the end of the video. All right, so the first target to chat through is the water bottle. And water bottles, I think, are abundant and available, and that's really their pro. They're easy to amass because you're probably getting them from various beverages that you drink. You probably know people that use them. It's easy to collect, gather, and they're also easy to dispose of and recyclable. So it's pretty easy target, cost effective in that they are abundant, available, and generally free. And again, the disposal side of things, they don't have a huge impact environmentally because you can recycle them, generally speaking. And if that's important to you, then I suppose there's that. The downside to them is that they're messy. One, they spray water all over the place. They freeze, which is not great for me. Again, I mentioned the perpetual winter that I'm typically in. And when you cut them, water spreads all over the place. And if you have like Japanese style swords, the handles get wet and it can do, funny things to the blade. If you have juices or some sort of residue that's acidic, it can stain the blade, particularly in very warm weather. It acts quite quickly. So water bottles are not my ideal cutting target. Their benefit is that they're abundant, available, and generally speaking, people are familiar with cutting water bottles because of the cost effectiveness and abundance of them. So they're a fairly familiar target to people, and as you cut them and explain how things are going, they're easier to read, I suppose, because of the availability of said target. But they're not good necessarily because they spray water all over the place, and generally you only get like one or two cuts out of them. There's some exceptions to that depending on your skill and the size of the bottle and the plastic that it's made from, but generally speaking, you don't get a whole lot of usage out of each one of those things, and they're quite messy. So I don't particularly find them to be a good target. And one maybe very cautionary tale that I can note that might be helpful is that they can be quite dangerous to cut. So if you examine like a juice bottle or a bottle that's plastic that's made to contain pressure, like a soda bottle or something like that, generally speaking, towards the neck, it's much thicker plastic. And if you look at the threaded area, it's often more than 1 millimeter thick. I didn't bring out a caliper to measure, but they're often quite thick plastic in that area. The sidewalls are generally much thinner, and so there you go. I've chipped and rolled and damaged swords cutting the neck area and the tops, kind of the screw area, where the lid screws onto the bottle. I've damaged a few swords in cutting that area of a water bottle. I've had manufacturers tell me that their swords aren't designed to do it. Particularly differentially hardened blades with very refined edges aren't meant to cut that thick, hard kind of plastic, and I've had it damage things. That could depend on the quality of the sword, the weather, and you might argue that, hey, that's stupid that a sword could be damaged on a water bottle, but some of that plastic is really quite thick, and some of my angles are quite bad, and when I mix the two, bad results have happened. So bear in mind that if you are cutting water bottles and you're getting into it, then beware the neck of and the cap area of those bottles. Sometimes they can have ill effects on your sword, and it's always a bummer. So bear that in mind. The bottles also generally have some like kind of I don't know, adhesive or something like that to keep the labeling on, and that smudges the sword and can be a pain to wipe off. So bear in mind that when you're cutting them, there's a little bit of futzing and cleaning to do afterwards. But many of you have probably cut water bottles. I don't imagine that that's any kind of surprise, but I do think that they are a useful target in that you get a single kind of serving. They're available, abundant, inexpensive, and they offer, again, a story to tell where you can evaluate your cuts. That said, I don't think that they're a particularly good target. It's just that they're abundant and free, and that's what makes them a target worthy of giving a shot to. But otherwise, I don't think that they're a great target. That's my personal opinion on the subject. If you have any other thoughts about why they might be good or bad, throw them in the commentary down below. I think my preferred target, if I'm going on the inexpensive side, would be a pool noodle. Now, there is a cost because you don't just happen to generally have pool noodles available that you can dispose of the same way you do a water bottle, but they're relatively inexpensive. There's dollar stores around me. I live in the US, and the Dollar General store, something like that around. I'll go in and buy just a full box of them. They're $1 a piece, but you get a lot of mileage out of a pool noodle, and they're a target that doesn't get as much credit as it deserves. They're deceptively challenging to cut. If you don't have a keen edge or good alignment, then they don't necessarily do you any favors in cutting, and it's easy to bat them around. If you have a sharp sword and bad edge alignment, you kind of bite in initially, but bat the pool noodle around, and it kind of stands itself back up. If you do have good edge alignment, though, and you have good form, then it doesn't necessarily take a particularly sharp sword to make it through, but you do have to throw a lot of momentum behind it, because a slow cut, even well aligned, doesn't do much to kind of snap the pool noodle and get it to have any kind of cutting potential. So they are a useful tool, and again, you can read the results, you can see what's going on. They're a little tougher to read, but at the same time, they do offer you some kind of tangible evidence of what happened. They're also quite long, so you get a lot of mileage out of them, and you can kind of reuse them. So I've been really cheap, and I've taken toothpicks or twigs, I've stuffed it in the pool noodle and kind of put it back together so that I can get more cuts out of the pool noodle. You can throw a dab of tape or something like that on there, and since the idea is to be fast moving with a sharp sword, even if it's not stuck together in the way it was, you can still get a little bit more out of the pool noodle. So that dollar can potentially go a very, very long way with a pool noodle, and it's relatively inexpensive to get into. So that's one perk, I think, of pool noodles. You can also wrap the pool noodle with other things like cloth and things like that to add mass, or put a sapling or a pole or something in the center to add mass, but I think the pool noodle is actually maybe more useful as a cutting tool just by itself without any additional kind of mass or substance to it, because part of the perk is that you have to have both of the pool noodle kind of laughs at you, or you rip it off the target and it doesn't actually cut. As soon as you add kind of something to stabilize the pool noodle and keep it upright, or add something in the center, the fluff of the pool noodle isn't really challenging to cut necessarily, and I don't think it adds the same benefit. I don't know that they're recyclable either, so if that's important to you, then I suppose know that there may be some impact there, and obviously there is a cost because it's $1. But I think pool noodles are actually a really good target to practice on. I have a lot of fun with them. They're easy to pick up as well. They do blow away in the wind and whatnot, but generally there's sizable enough chunks for me to pick up, and it's not wet. It doesn't make a mess. If I'm cutting them outside, they don't get really impacted by weather, so they don't freeze. They're easy to spot usually in the snow or in the lawn, because they're typically made of bright colors, so cleanup is also an easy thing to do. All right, so anyway, pool noodles, I think they're actually a great target. Next to pool noodles, I would start putting in newspaper. That's one of my other favorite targets to cut. Newspaper can be used in a lot of different ways. One is just hanging a single sheet horizontally facing you so that you can cut the newspaper horizontally or vertically, or whatever you want to do. Generally, I'll suspend it with clips or ties. I've seen people hang them from coat hangers with tape, something like that, or paper clips and the like, and then it helps to weight them at the bottom, either with a paper clip or some other thing that you can easily attach and detach to go through multiple sheets of paper as you're hanging them, and something that's easy to work with. This is pretty helpful because, one, you don't need a particularly sharp sword to do it, and it gives you a very clear idea of if you're holding your angle over a long period. And so you should be able to do some of this with a bowkin if you have good form. I can never quite successfully do it with a bowkin, but I don't need a particularly sharp sword to get a long, good, clean cut on just a single sheet of newspaper. And I find it to be a really helpful exercise, and if you have a stack of newspaper, you have a lot of opportunity to really practice a lot of swings. It's not detrimental to a sword either. It doesn't hurt it. There's no residue. It will leave scratches on a sword potentially, but it's not particularly challenging or hard to do on a sword, or it doesn't have the opportunity to damage your sword or anything like that to cut a single sheet of paper. A water bottle might. A pool noodle generally won't. It can leave scratches and particularly fine polishes, but the newspaper can do that as well. And there's, again, you could hit one of the clips or something like that, so be wary, but generally speaking, it's pretty harmless to your sword as well. Another thing you can do with newspaper is roll them into small cylinders. I generally don't do this, and I don't have any footage to share with you of me doing it, but the point is that you can roll it into a small cylinder, place it on top of something, and try to cut through the paper. If you're not doing it well, if your sword isn't sharp and your edge alignment isn't good, you're just going to bat that little cylinder of paper around. But if you have both, then you'll make it through similar to a pool noodle. I find it to be harder to futz with these things, though. One, I have to roll them and make them, and two, I have to find a place that's indoors because any amount of wind tends to blow the thing over, and again, weather permitting, I generally don't get a chance to cut when there's zero wind whatsoever, and I find the little things blow away all the time. So anyway, that isn't something that I personally like, but I've seen people do it and find value in it. I prefer to have it suspended and weighted, and I find that to be a more useful tool. The other thing you can do with newspaper is make a kind of tatami-like basically a tatami analogy. So you've probably seen people cut tatami mats. That's the kind of rolled straw or grass into a large mat that's typically made for flooring, and I'll talk about that after this. But the rolled newspaper, you can lay the sheets out, roll them up into a big cylinder, and wet them the same way you would tatami. Generally, you want to dry them out. There's a lot more variation in cutting rolled newspaper. If you soak it for a couple weeks and pull it out and immediately cut it, it's real spongy and kind of like paper mache and maybe easy to cut through. If you let it dry out for a day or two, then it's much denser than tatami, at least if you're talking about similar diameters, and it's much harder to cut and much less forgiving as well. So if you're cutting into that newspaper, just bear in mind that if you're making it, try to start smaller because they are denser to cut than tatami, or can be, and I'd recommend that you soak them for a couple days at least, and then dry them potentially for 2 days, and they're still going to be wet and damp, generally speaking, depending on your weather. They're still probably going to be damp, at least at the core, and it's just less forgiving a target. So when you cut through it, it's easy to bend your sword. If you stop in the middle of said newspaper roll, that's a lot of pressure on the sword. It's possible to bend it. Should it damage your sword? No, and you can argue whether it's abuse or not. But if you had bad technique and your edge alignment's off, and you're not positioned well, then that's a lot of stress on a sword. And bending in a target is a thing that swords can certainly do. So bear that in mind as you're rolling newspaper, that it's a more challenging target, but newspaper, fortunately, is again something that is abundant and generally free. If you know somebody that has a newspaper subscription, they're usually pretty happy to part with the old newspapers, as nobody generally keeps them. So if you have access to them, it's an abundant source of cutting targets that you can also roll up and get something that offers a lot of resistance in terms of cutting. It's a pain in the ass, admittedly, to roll them up, but tatami, which I'll talk about next, is getting expensive and scarce. At the moment, it doesn't seem like you can buy a lot of mats. There's a shortage going around at the moment, but before that, mats would cost potentially $10 a piece, sometimes more or less, depending on the quantity you bought or where you got them. And so it's a pretty expensive target. And to me, being a cheapskate, it seems worth rolling up some newspaper to get something that offers a similar level of training availability. Also, they're recyclable. You wet them down and you can throw them in the recycling bin because it's just newspaper. Anyway, that's enough on newspaper. Hopefully that's been somewhat interesting to you. The next target I'll touch on is tatami, and I don't need to necessarily go over a whole lot with tatami because you're probably familiar enough with it. I will say a couple notes on tatami. One, it's very expensive as a cutting target. Individual mats can cost upwards of $10 now, and there's this, they're scarce at the moment. They're tough to find, and before the scarcity happened, they were, a lot with shipping. $5 is a great deal if you can find it for that on tatami, but depending on how many you were buying, where you were getting them from, what the shipping cost you, it wouldn't be surprising to have each mat cost you $10. And sometimes, if you're bad like me, you only get a cut or two out of it, and that's a lot of money per cut. So they're not a very cost-effective cutting target. They're biodegradable and all that kind of stuff, which I guess is nice. But shipping them to and fro likely has some sort of impact. They're heavy, and they are expensive, and they're not abundant, and blah, 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 blah. So that's the downside of tatami. They're also somewhat dangerous to cut if you're not particularly good at cutting. So bear in mind that If you have a differentially hardened blade or a blade that's susceptible to bending, bad form can put a lot of stress on a blade. Cutting tatami, deceptively so because they can seem like soft targets, but a bad cut will stop your blade right in the middle of the tatami, put a lot of stress on it. And I've seen plenty of people, experienced people with very expensive swords, bend their swords cutting individual rolls of tatami. So bear in mind that it is an exercise that will put stress on a sword, and while your sword should survive it, it still can cause bending if your form is not in check. The other things to note about tatami, one, if you do have access to it, just a slight tip is to fold it in two. So fold it in two pieces, or not fold it. You understand what folding is. I don't need to elaborate there, but fold the tatami mat and then take the end pieces, the two ends, and use that as the center of the roll, and that will prevent the little strands and bits from kind of fraying out and being loose and unsightly while you're doing the cut. So if you see my tatami cutting as of late, since I've been given that tip, I try to fold them and then roll them and then use the center of that fold as the outside and then point that away from me. So I will not have the same kind of fraying and loose strands that tend to pop up when doing tatami cutting. So there's a tip for you. Anyway, tatami is a great tool to cut. It's supposed to be analogous to an arm or a torso, or I don't necessarily know because I haven't cut either of those things, but I will say that it does offer some resistance. It's very easy. It gives you a pretty wide area to read and examine. The resistance also tells you, if you're coming in an angle but you don't have maybe the right grip or something, you're gonna twist and pivot in that, and so you can kind of see some of that a little easier in a tatami mat given the resistance than you can in a water bottle or in a pool noodle or a newspaper. You'll pretty much see the same thing if it's a thick roll, but tatami gives you that, and it's less detrimental on your sword. Bear in mind that, again, there are like usually some maybe fibers or sugars or something like that can leave stains on your sword, and it certainly will scratch it. But anyway, you probably know all that about tatami already. It's a great target. I really enjoy cutting it. It's just that you need to wet it and pay for it and ship it, and it smells really bad if you leave it in the water for too long as well. That's something that doesn't get captured on the videos, that if I soak it and I leave a mat out there, especially for like 2 weeks or something like that, because I didn't get around to cutting it, when I pull that water out, it is funky smelling. It is a mix. It is very, it's a mix between like horse shit and some other kind of ass. I don't know, but it's the stagnant water is not a fun thing to have around. People have told me to use like dish soap or something like that, but I like to dump the water out in my yard. So if I put some sort of something that would keep the smell at bay, then I can't dump the water out and feed it to my grass. So anyway, tatami. The next bit I will talk about is a slightly harder target, and that is, to me, I use saplings or young trees or branches, basically green wood, something that isn't fully hard yet, and those are all available. Unfortunately, I've cut most of them down in my backyard, and I kind of got to ask my neighbors if I can go into their kind of foresty area and cut stuff down. It's not nice to go on somebody else's property and just take their trees down, but they're not particularly hard. They offer the same type of opportunity to bend your swords as tatami or newspaper in a thick roll might, where a bad cut will potentially deform your edge, potentially bend your sword. So keep that in mind. Usually saplings around the 1.5 inch, maybe upwards of 2 inches are generally safe to cut, but bear in mind the thicker that you go, the better your sword needs to be along with your skill in order to survive the experience unscathed. Enough hardwood cutting, though, or sapling cutting, or green bamboo cutting for that matter, will likely loosen things up eventually. It's still impacting the sword. It's still causing some movement, so don't be surprised if things need tightening or maintenance or something like that after some amount of cuts. How many that should be, I don't necessarily know. It depends on how sharp you like to keep your swords, what type of piece or sword you're using, but bear in mind that maintenance will likely be required. The next thing I will talk about are the other types of hardwoods like green bamboo. Obviously, that's great. I use saplings as an analogy. All the things that I said about saplings and kind of young trees are likely applicable to green bamboo. I just don't have access to it. I don't cut it very often. I think I have cut it in the past, but I don't really recall much about the experience, and I don't have access to it. There are some sword clubs around the area that have access to green bamboo, and I don't know how they ship it in, but anyway, it doesn't grow in my yard. I've tried. if you have access to it, it's a great tool. I wish it did. I hear that it sprouts up all over the place and is quite a thing to deal with. But I would love to have an abundance of cheap targets that grow quickly. It just doesn't seem to work out for me that way. The other things you might have access to, I don't know what type of organic material or foliage is in your area that offers a similar type of cutting medium. But if you have something, then obviously that's good. Hopefully available and free for you to cut. The next thing I'll maybe chat on briefly is Corrugate, and I kind of skipped over it when I talked about paper, but you can get cardboard shipping tubes. I've seen them to ship various signage as well as rugs and things like that, but the thick cardboard tubes, I see them cut pretty frequently on Cold Steel's channel, I think. They're good cutting targets, as well as like milk jugs and things like that. I find that anything that's cardboard tends to be abrasive on the sword. It certainly leaves scratches, and it can dull the edge quicker. I don't know the science behind it. I'm sure somebody will chime in with it, but it does generally tend to dull an edge quicker and leave a lot of scratches. I also find that packages can have staples hidden in them, so bear in mind that if you're cutting a cardboard box from Amazon because you have it around and need to toss it anyway, there might be some staples in it or something like that, and those little bits of metal can leave chips and nicks in the edge of a sword. So bear in mind, use some caution and make sure that there's no metal bits in your Corrugate before you cut at any of that cardboard box or tubes. Now you can wet it, that softens the stuff down, but a lot of people generally tend to cut the cardboard tubes or boxes dry, and then again, same benefits I suppose as paper. They're recyclable, you can toss them, but there's certainly some detriment to the sword. If you have an abundance of cardboard though, it's certainly a fun target to cut and line up. You can make little piñatas out of them. It can be very, very fun. The downside I would say to cutting Corrugate though is that, or at least as I've used it, I don't find it to be a particularly great target. I've cut milk jugs and things like that, but the water bottles tend to be easier to rinse out, and they don't, I don't know, generally the milk jugs had milk in them, and they get really stinky if I keep them around too long. So that's why I tend not to use those, or I recycle them quicker and just save plastic bottles because they're easier to rinse out and generally don't have things that stink in them as much as the milk does. Cardboard boxes and stuff like that, if I unfold them and use them in a similar capacity to the newspaper, it's not bad, but they're tougher to weight, and I find the newspaper does just as much and is more convenient to keep around. So I don't cut a lot of Corrugate given how detrimental it is to an edge, and just I don't find as much use in it as I would any of the other targets that I mentioned. So that's probably why I completely overlooked it until the last, when I probably should have talked about it with paper. Anyway. All right, sword friends, so I think that wraps up all of the types of targets that I would recommend you cut, or that one might cut with a sword if they're trying to improve their swordsmanship or cutting ability. I have also cut other things that I would consider abusive, and so I'll talk a little bit about those now, but bear in mind I don't really think that there's a whole lot of educational value to it. There may be some use to it, but I don't know that the average person is going to find a lot of merit in it, or that they individually benefit swordsmanship type skills and stuff. So I'll talk a little bit about them. And the first one is actually wood. And that's because there's been a lot of chatter recently on the interwebs around whether cutting logs, wood, stumps, things like that is an abusive thing to swords. And this is maybe topical in the moment, but to me I would say yes. And there's a bit of context that comes in the background there, and that has to do with your expectations. So I even asked on the internet recently whether cutting a tatami mat, given the stress shown on a sword, was abusive or not, and there were some mixed opinions about it. But I think a lot of it has to do with what you're expecting. And I believe a number of the people watching my channel look at some of the stupid things I do with a sword, and they're trying to buy a sword because they like it, but it's probably going to hang on the wall most of the time, and they're not going to use it very often, and they're kind of expecting things to hold together in a way that may be unrealistic, honestly, and likely they're looking for kind of maximum resilience in a sword that frankly isn't going to see a ton of use. If you are a swordsman and you cut frequently and you use your sword a lot, then you're probably aware that maintenance is required. Nathan at Arms and Armor mentioned this in his video, and he used the word maintenance kind of gingerly as he's talking about cutting wood and things like sharpening, or tightening up any kind of rattles or something like that, or unbending a sword. And sword users who frequently cut things will likely consider those just a cost of doing business with a sword, or a cost of using the sword, or maintenance, or something that just comes with the territory. As we're somebody buying their first sword, or somebody unfamiliar with cutting, or that doesn't do it very often, if they cut into a target and all of a sudden the suba wiggles a bit, well, that may be the kind of the unacceptable to them, I suppose, based on their expectation. Now, whether it is or isn't the question. It is that if you're expecting a sword to stay pristine, not be scratched, not have any problems, not need any kind of tightening, that there's no cost to cutting the target, then unfortunately, that's not going to happen. Regardless of what targets you cut, or even frankly, if you don't cut targets, the sword will likely age and need some degree of maintenance at some point. Even if you just swing it around at air. I've seen plenty of experienced practitioners break their Iaito having never cut anything. Now, granted, it's not a steel sword, but I've seen people draw their zinc aluminum Iaito enough times and just stop abruptly, and enough stopping has created enough shock in the sword over time to usually break it off right at the hilt above the habaki, or below the habaki. So I've seen people break their kind of sword without ever actually cutting anything, just from swinging it and stopping it quickly enough time over a period of years. And not the cheap ones either, the relatively expensive nice Iaitos and such. So the point is that swords will require maintenance over time. If you cut hard targets, if you smack things into logs, it will require them more expeditiously. And if your expectation is that the sword remain pristine, that nothing rattles or wiggles or everything stays sharp, then I would argue that cutting into a log is not realistic, and that you will likely need to have some sort of repair at some point more quickly. Anyway, the other bit as I talk about cutting logs is when I cut a log, I'm trying to abuse the sword. I'm cutting something too thick. I know that it's going to put a lot of shock on the sword, and I'm trying to see if it bends. I'm throwing lots of power behind it generally, and not a lot of direction, not a lot of good form, in an attempt to see how much of that the sword can take before it bends or does something that it ideally shouldn't do. And so in my case, I consider it abusive, because whenever I take a sword to a log or a stump or something like that, I'm going into it with the intent of abusing the sword. So that's also a little bit of bias on my part. Anyway, it's an interesting topic. Should a sword be able to survive? Certainly. I mean, as a weapon of war, of course. But if your expectation is that it does that and has no consequence, that you can hit shields and logs and pikes and things like that all day long, every day for 1,000 years without any impact to the sword, then I would argue that is unrealistic. And I suppose the question to ask yourself is, at what point should a hilt develop some rattle? What point, how many cuts should a sword take before it requires sharpening or honing the edge? How much should it flex before you would expect it to take some sort of bend that needs to be corrected? How many of those bends can a sword take before it's expected that the sword should be retired from fatigue, or that it's no longer safe to use? I don't know the answers to those questions, but think on them as you might think cutting a log is not abusive. At what point does it become abusive? I don't know that, but anyway, those are some thoughts. Other things that I've cut: aluminum cans or steel cans, shaving cream cans, which are really fun. Anything under pressure that you cut, be wary of, but it is very, very fun to do. Aluminum cans I found degrade the edge. I've seen them nick an edge at times or roll an edge. They also scratch the patina or the surface of the steel quite a bit, so I don't necessarily consider them a worthy target to cut. Should a sword make it through an aluminum can, of course, but the cost of doing that to the edge as well as the polish on the sword is pretty significant, so I don't advocate doing it, and I would consider it abusive for that reason, when a water bottle generally has less potential to do that. Shaving cream cans and steel cans of that sort, generally speaking, do mar the edge, roll it, or nick it in some way, shape, or form. Very, very fun to cut, and if you have a sword you don't care much about, or you have the capacity to sharpen it, I recommend you try it. Put on some sort of face protection, ideally more than I do, and it is quite a hoot to cut. I get those shaving cream cans as well from the dollar store. Other things that I've cut, steel poles, building materials, and large planks of wood. There are some benefits to potentially using them. I did find some actual value in taking what basically I was trying to metaphorically use as a spear, but it was just a kind of a 2x2 from building material. But using my sword to hold that up in exercise, when I do this with a bokin versus say a yari or a nagi nada or something like that in practice, the wood pieces just kind of move along each other. But in holding a sword up and trying to move that wood along, the edge would bite in. So how to hold the sword to advance and direct the enemy's weapon, I did find that actually useful to practice with a sword. I'm not hitting it necessarily, but in terms of using that pike, going in and trying to direct the pike away so that I could move in closer and and potentially get into striking range. So some of that exercise was actually kind of helpful. I wouldn't consider it abusive until you start striking the wooden beam with a sword. So there are some useful exercises potentially to do there with a live blade, because how the edge interacts with things is something that's useful. I've found that to also be true from doing sword on sword type action, not necessarily just in seeing what happens, but very often as I'm practicing with a bowkin or some other steel blunted sword, the edges don't interact with each other in the same way. And while it's very dangerous, taking two edges and trying to do some sort of binding work is helpful. Even if it's on a stationary object, I have some semblance of an idea of how a sharp sword will interact with another sharp edge, which can be helpful, as well as understanding when my edge is marred and dinged, how it interacts with other targets that I might cut, or how it binds or moves around or interacts with another sword. So I do think that is helpful, but it's kind of a nuance that you're likely never going to run into, and I don't know how honestly helpful it is, but it certainly I found it to be informative. But the kind of informative that's like helpful once you're aware of it, it's pretty easy to correct if you have some idea of how swordsmanship works. And I don't know that it's something that you need to practice all day, every day, or thousands of times. It's a kind of a nuance that's once you're aware of it, it kind of, I don't know, blends in your swordsmanship pretty easily, or at least that's my opinion. Anyway, that's all I've got. I've rambled honestly quite enough, and it's time for me to do some daddy duty. So I'm going to stop here. And if you have any comments, questions, if you think I've completely missed anything, or I'm totally off base, or you have some other ideas of targets to cut, I'd love to hear it in the commentary down below. Anyway, hopefully it's been interesting. As always, cheers, and thanks for watching. Or residue or something on them, or they're often holding acidic beverages. So be sure that you're wiping things off kind of quickly. I've had juice stain swords. I've had the
burger.
Yes, a burger would be lovely. I love you're just tired to walk in. Burger. I don't care that you're recording. I need to know if you're eating a burger. Burger.
Yes, I do want a burger with onions on it.
Ooh, onions. Vera, would you chop some onions? Hey, YouTube, that's what I always tell my wife. I think on my tombstone, because I will inevitably die before her, it will be written, "Hey, Vera, will you chop some onions?" as the thing I've said most in my life. Anyway.